Imagine standing before a 19th century asylum. Feel the chilling shadow it casts over the manicured lawns. Look up at the impossible peaks of its roofline, the copper turning that ghostly, oxidized green, the towering steeples reaching into a sky that no longer remembers who built them. If you have ever stood in the courtyard of one of these colossal, palatial structures, you have likely felt it. A deep, unsettling sensation in the pit of your stomach. A profound spatial and temporal dissonance. The building feels too heavy, too grand, too intricately perfect for the era it was supposedly constructed in. Look at the ground floor. Notice how the massive stone windows seem to plunge directly into the earth, as if the soil itself rose up to swallow the foundation in some unspoken, undocumented deluge, a flood of mud and time. The official plaques bolted to the brickwork will tell you a story of 19th century benevolence. They will tell you that a sudden, unprecedented wave of human compassion swept through the bureaucratic elite, prompting them to construct these sprawling architectural marvels for the mentally frail. But the stone does not lie, and the timeline is mathematically, logistically, and physically impossible. We are told of the Kirkbride plan, introduced in 1854 by a physician who believed that architecture itself could cure the mind. A beautiful, comforting narrative. According to the official history, reformers suddenly decided to pull the impoverished and the insane out of damp basements and local jails, elevating them into palaces of healing. But let us pause and look at the reality of the 19th century. An era of horse-drawn carts, unpaved muddy roads, cholera outbreaks, and rudimentary hand tools. Yet, in a mere 15 years following the publication of this plan, hundreds of these monumental complexes appeared seemingly overnight. I want you to truly visualize the sheer scale of this endeavor. We are talking about sprawling megastructures with miles of corridors, hand-carved stone masonry, intricate arched ceilings, subterranean tunnel networks, and highly advanced passive ventilation systems. By 1880, there were more than 140 of these colossal public institutions operating in the United States alone. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. How does a fledgling nation, supposedly still developing its basic industrial infrastructure, suddenly manifest the wealth, the master masons, the logistics, and the labor force to simultaneously erect dozens of royal palaces in the wilderness, only to fill them with the most discarded members of society? Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The architectural language of these asylums is identical to the grand post offices, the magnificent train stations, and the towering universities of the exact same period. High arched windows, red brick and heavy limestone, complex geometry that baffles modern contractors. Why does a hospital for the insane require the aesthetic majesty of an ancient cathedral or an imperial court? The silence from traditional historians on this logistical miracle is deafening. They ask us to believe that men with wheelbarrows and wooden scaffolding raised these empires of stone in the blink of an eye. But there is another answer, an answer that explains the mud at the foundation and the perfection of the arches. They did not build these magnificent complexes. They found them. The buildings were already there. They were inherited, repurposed remnants of a vast, interconnected, and highly advanced civilization that had just been quietly, systematically erased from the earth. And if the buildings were already there, then the narrative of human compassion falls apart. They were not constructing hospitals. They were claiming territory. And more importantly, they were acquiring the most secure, inescapable fortresses imaginable to lock away the very people who knew the truth. This brings us to the darkest, most agonizing chapter of this architectural mystery. If these buildings were not built to cure the sick, then who exactly were the thousands of people suddenly marched into their echoing halls? To find the answer, we must blow the dust off the original admission ledgers of places like the Willard Asylum or the Danvers State Hospital. When you drag your finger down the columns of faded cursive ink, you expect to see diagnoses of severe mania, of violent schizophrenia, of ailments that genuinely required isolation for the safety of the public. But that is not what you find. The records are saturated with a terrifyingly ambiguous, entirely invented disease, a diagnosis that was weaponized to incarcerate healthy, lucid individuals. They were locked in the dark because they suffered from nostalgia. Today, we use the word nostalgia to describe a bittersweet, fleeting memory of our youth. But in the mid-19th century, the medical bureaucracy classified nostalgia as a fatal, consuming, and incurable psychiatric disease. It was defined as an uncontrollable, pathological yearning for a home that no longer existed, a desperate, maddening desire for a world that had vanished. Think about the timing. This sudden epidemic of pathological nostalgia and the explosive boom in asylum admissions perfectly coincided with the exact decades, the 1840s and 1850s, when the vast empires of the Old World, the sprawling, advanced civilization often mapped as Tartaria, were being methodically scrubbed from the encyclopedias, the globes, and the classrooms of the new society. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological torture. You are an adult who remembers the world before the reset. You remember the free energy, the harmony, the true purpose of the colossal buildings now being claimed by bureaucrats in ill-fitting suits. You speak of the old ways. You long for the world that was just stolen from you, and for this, for the crime of remembering. They brand you a lunatic. They did not create these asylums to heal the mind. They utilized the asylums to quarantine the memory of the human race. The diagnosis of nostalgia was the perfect bureaucratic tool for a managed forgetting. You cannot simply execute tens of thousands of citizens who refuse to accept the new timeline. That would cause a revolt. But if you label them insane, if you pathologize their grief, you can strip them of their rights, confiscate their property, and permanently silence them behind walls of stone so thick that no one will ever hear them scream. The adults of the old world were processed, categorized, and buried alive within the very structures their ancestors had likely designed. But removing the adults was only half of the equation. To truly restart a civilization, to truly force a new, artificial timeline onto humanity, you have to do something about the children. And so we arrive at the platform of the most heartbreaking, inexplicable logistical operation in modern history. The Orphan Trains. Between 1854 and 1929, the whistle of the locomotive became the sound of absolute erasure. Picture the scene. Cold, soot-stained railway stations on the East Coast, filled with an ocean of terrified, bewildered faces. Over 250,000 children were abruptly, systematically loaded onto train cars and shipped deep into the rural expanses of the American Midwest and the South. 250,000. The sheer volume of human displacement is staggering. We are taught that this was another grand humanitarian effort, that the streets of New York and Boston were simply overflowing with the unwanted offspring of destitute immigrants, and that charitable societies decided to send them to wholesome farming families for a better life. But the official poverty statistics and the demographic data of the mid-19th century cannot even begin to account for the sudden, spontaneous generation of 250,000 orphaned children. Where did they come from? Why did this massive influx of parentless youth occur at the exact same moment the asylums were filling to capacity with adults suffering from nostalgic grief? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and the details are deeply, profoundly chilling. Many of these children arrived on the platforms without any surnames at all. They were entirely blank slates, carrying only first names, possessing no birth certificates, no family Bibles, no paper trail of any kind. And those who did possess surnames often carried ancient, complex Slavic or Germanic names. Names that violently contradicted the expected demographics of the local urban poor. They were not the children of local factory workers. They were the spoils of a hidden war. They were the deleted generation. Follow the tracks. Trace the logistical roots of these children, and a horrifying geographic overlap emerges. The collection points, the processing centers, and the temporary holding facilities for these orphans were frequently located in the exact same neighborhoods, sometimes even adjacent to the very institutional complexes receiving the influx of newly diagnosed lunatics. It was an industrial-scale sorting machine. The parents, the elders, the ones whose minds were fully formed and infected with the memory of the old world, were directed into the asylums to rot under the banner of psychiatric care. The children, whose minds were still pliable, whose memories could still be overwritten, were directed onto the trains. When these children arrived at the farming communities of the Midwest, they were lined up on station platforms, inspected like livestock, and taken in by strangers. But the final, most devastating act of this humanitarian charade was the legal renaming. The state mandated that these children take the surnames of their new, government-approved adoptive families. In a single stroke of a pen, their genealogy was severed forever. Their ancient bloodlines, their true heritage, the memories of their parents locked away in stone fortresses, all of it was wiped clean. They were handed new names, new histories, and a new, fabricated reality. They were taught to operate the plows, to fuel the Industrial Revolution, and to never question where they came from. The Orphan Trains were not a rescue mission. They were an identity laundering operation on a continental scale, ensuring that the heirs of the old world would grow up believing they were nothing more than the lucky recipients of the new world's charity. But not everyone was caught in the net. There were those who saw the sorting machine for what it was, and they attempted to disappear into the vast, untamed wilderness of the continent. Let us look at the strange, isolated havens that historians dismiss as mere religious experiments. Between 1820 and 1900, over 700 utopian communities mysteriously sprang up across North America. Groups like the Harmony Society or the Amana Colonies. The official narrative suggests these were simple, zealous pioneers trying to build agricultural communes. But when you examine their actual footprints, the story shatters. These groups did not arrive as helpless, fumbling farmers learning to survive. They arrived with highly complex, fully formed industrial skills. They possessed advanced textile manufacturing techniques, precision milling capabilities, and an understanding of acoustic architecture and chemistry that far exceeded the rough frontier society around them. They built thriving, self-sustaining micro-cities almost instantly. It is highly probable that these utopias were, in fact, silent refuges. They were the enclaves of old-world survivors who managed to escape the institutional dragnet, pooling their remaining technological knowledge and hiding in plain sight under the guise of eccentric religious sects. And if you look closely at the surviving ledgers of some of these communities from the 1860s and 1870s, you will find something deeply poignant. You will see the quiet, undocumented influx of young children without any prior history. Children who simply appeared and were softly absorbed into the fold. Were these the orphans who slipped away from the trains? Were these the children rescued from the system, hidden away by the last remaining engineers of a forgotten age? The scale of this operation, this managed forgetting, was not confined to a single nation. The silence of the global archives is perhaps the most terrifying evidence of all. If you look at the demographic data of the mid-19th century, you will find impossible voids. Between the census of 1850 and the census of 1870, entire categories of people simply vanished from the statistical records without any adequate explanation of plague, war, or famine to justify the drop. And the exact same psychiatric revolution, the exact same explosion of palatial Kirkbride-style asylums, happened simultaneously across the entire globe. From the Gladesville Hospital in Sydney, Australia, to the Yarra Bend in Melbourne, to the sprawling asylums of Paris, London, and deep into South America. The exact same monumental architecture, the exact same diagnostic suddenness, appearing everywhere at once, decades before the laying of transoceanic telegraph cables could have possibly allowed for such synchronized global urban planning. The entire realm was undergoing a coordinated reset. The survivors of the previous age were being rounded up and contained, globally, in the very buildings their civilization had left behind. But truth has a way of resisting absolute erasure. It embeds itself in the very foundations of the world, waiting for the wrecking ball to crack the facade. And the facade did crack. In the early 2000s, during the slow, agonizing demolition of the infamous Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, as the heavy machinery tore through the colossal stone walls that had stood like silent sentinels for over a century, the workers discovered something that sent a chill through the local historical societies. Sealed deep inside the heavy masonry, carefully and deliberately hidden in the dark, hollow spaces between the stones by the earliest patients, were relics. These were not the ravings of the mad. They were the desperate, heartbreaking time capsules of a silenced people. Workers pulled out fragile, yellowing documents covered in an elegant, flowing cursive script. But it was a script that linguists could not definitively identify, resembling extinct or severely altered variations of Old Slavic and Cyrillic dialects. They found strange, meticulously crafted wooden figurines, carved in traditions that matched no known local indigenous or colonial art styles. They found inexplicably complex hand tools of unknown metallic composition, hidden away like sacred artifacts. Why would patients, suffering from supposed mental decay, go to such extraordinary, calculated lengths to pry away heavy stones and seal these specific objects inside the architecture? The silence was deafening, because the answer is unbearable. They were not insane. They were the last custodians of a murdered world. They knew they would never leave those walls. They knew their children had been taken, renamed, and scattered to the winds. They knew the new society was actively rewriting the textbooks and erasing the maps. And so, in their final act of defiance, they hid the proof of their existence within the very stones of the palaces that had been turned into their tombs. They used the architecture of their ancestors as a vault for the future, praying that one day someone would tear down the walls and realize that the people locked inside were not the monsters of the story. They were the architects. If an entire global culture of highly sophisticated, technologically capable people was abruptly fractured, if the adults were condemned to the shadows of the asylum, and the children were dispersed on iron trains to forget their own names, what happened to the profound knowledge they possessed? The understanding of cymatics, of atmospheric energy, of architecture that harmonizes with the earth. It was locked away, suppressed, and replaced by the rigid, polluting, exploitative industrial paradigm we are enslaved by today. We must look in the mirror and ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. Who are we, really? If 250,000 children had their identities legally erased and rewritten in a single generation, How many of us are walking around today carrying the fabricated surnames assigned by a 19th century bureaucrat? We look back at our family trees, tracing the branches to the 1850s, and suddenly, the trail goes cold. A missing census record. An undocumented great-great-grandfather who simply appeared on a farm in Ohio. We assumed they were just poor immigrants lost to time. But what if they were the deleted generation? We are the heirs of the amnesiacs. We are the descendants of the orphan trains, wandering through the remnants of a world we were forced to forget. And when we visit the majestic, crumbling ruins of the past, when we walk the overgrown grounds of the old asylums, admiring the intricate brickwork and the soaring spires, we are not looking at monuments to 19th century charity. We are looking at the cages that replaced them. We are looking at the sites of a silent, global purge, a masterclass in managed forgetting. The palaces of the old world, repurposed as the final resting place for the very minds that remembered how to build them.